Hi everybody. So for those of you who have joined us all week or part of the week or just tuning in now, let me give you a rundown of what's been happening. Hi, Leah here. So this week is Pajama Week. Today is our final home stretch of Pajama Week. Pajamas are really easy, but if you've never sewn garments before, there's just terminology that's different, and there's a couple of different ways of doing things, and sometimes you need to make alterations to make them fit. So I embarked on sewing pajama pants for my kids, and Wednesday's video I walked you through lengthening a pattern. My daughter's a tall skinny beanpole, so we added 4 inches to the pants to keep the waist size right for her. And then the pair that I need to do for my son, unfortunately, it takes way longer to draft when you're talking through it on camera. We walked through adding length, and then yesterday I walked you guys through cutting and keeping your fabric on grain so that you don't have twisty legs on your pants. So anyway, pair of pants is cut. I'm going to show you guys a couple different options for how to sew these together. And then I'm actually going to sew them together and show you the fancy hem pressing tool, which is going to make folding up our hems and folding down our waistband really super easy. So first up, a few different options for construction. If you have a serger at home, you can do this almost entirely on your serger. If you have a sewing machine at home, you can do this you can do this entirely on your sewing machine, or you can do a combination of the above. Everybody's going to be a little bit different of how they like to do things. So pajama pants, I just serge my pajama pants for the most part. But I'm going to show you what it looks like for both options, so you can still have finished seams and keep your pants from unraveling. So a couple things to get started with here. The first really important information that you will need off your pattern if you're sewing garments is what your seam allowance is, because not every garment is the same and not every pattern is the same, and things will not fit if you use the wrong seam allowance. I think that kind of makes sense. So this is the pattern I'm making. Wait, this is the pattern I'm making. Okay, 3406. Making pajama pants out of flannel with an elastic waistband. So a couple things off the start here. When we're reading our pattern guide, in here in big bold letters, it will tell you what your seam allowance is. On this particular set of pajama pants, the seam allowance is a 1/4 inch, which is a little skinny for a garment. Most garments are sewn at 3/8 or 5/8. And then it also talks about how to sew this. So you can sew it with a standard sewing machine. That's the first thing I'm going to show you. And you can do both the construction seam and finishing your seams with your sewing machine. Or you can do 2 steps in one on a serger. And you can do, there's fancy ways of doing this. It's lots of fun. That's where we're going to start. So let me show you guys what a seam looks like and where you're watching while you sew this on your sewing machine. And each machine is a little bit different. So the Bernina presser foot, the 1C, so the needle's going to land right behind that center line on the center of this foot in the center needle position. On the Bernina plate, come a little closer here, Michelle. We have some markings that are going to help keep us out of trouble and keep us in line. If I had been thinking and I was actually going to sew this on this machine, I would get a 1/4 inch foot to sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance. The 1/4 inch marking from center is this first notch. This next notch is 1/8 of an inch over, and that's 3/8, 1/2 inch, 5/8. So that's where you're looking to have your fabric lined up to sew. So I'm going to do this with a wider seam allowance because it's easier to see what I'm talking about when you finish edges, and most garments don't have a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then if I was actually sewing, I'd probably pin these together We discussed pinning yesterday. I would pin perpendicular here because it's easier to pull pins out as you go. If this was a normal 5/8 seam, you would sew your construction line first. We're going to start in there and back up a few stitches. And then you're not watching where your needle is, you need to be watching where the edge of your fabric is sitting. So you want to keep your fabric along that 5/8 seam line if that's the seam allowance you're using. Lots of your machines have seam guides that you can attach into the back of your foot. So if you're a person who needs that to help keep you going straight, by all means use that. Use the tools that your machine has to make this easier. So this would be a construction seam, and it's big wide seam allowance. You wouldn't necessarily need to keep all of that, but I don't know, if your kids are growing, it might not hurt to leave a wider seam allowance because you can always sew things with a shallower seam allowance down the road and have them continue to fit. So at this point, the seam is secure. Your pants are going to stay together, but this outside raw edge might go wonky on you, and you should probably finish that seam. I would press my seam before doing the next step. So when you're pressing your seams in your garments, you don't want to wiggle your iron and distort your fabric, especially if the rest isn't sewn into anything yet. So press, and then you've got options as to how you press your seams. I usually press them. I'm about half and half for pressing open and not pressing open. But for this, I'm going to press them open. And might have 2 cents on that. You can press them closed too, to one side. And then that would be the inside of our pant leg. I don't want these raw edges to come apart in the laundry, and I certainly don't want them to come apart in the laundry and get stuck on my toes when I'm putting my pajama pants on, because that's normally where those would get stuck. Let's go back to the sewing machine and show you how to finish that edge. Okay, so for finishing seams on your sewing machine, most sewing machines came with a foot that looks like this. On the Bernina, it's a 2 or a 2A. On the Brother, it would be your G. And it's called an overcasting foot. So what an overcasting foot does for you, there's a little metal rod in behind this foot on the bottom side. So on Tuesday, I talked about the business part of your feet being the critical part to operation. So that little guide right there, little tiny metal pin, the stitch is going to form over the edge of your fabric and over the edge of this pin. And that will allow you to have nice flat edges on your finished seam as you go. So let's throw that on there and I'll show you what you're looking at. So lots of machines in Bernina land like to be told what they're doing. I'm going to tell it I have the 2A, so it keeps me safe. Or it's not, or the 480 doesn't care that I have a 2A because it's, oh yeah, this one you can't tell it what you're doing. However, some of your Berninas have something called Creative Consultant, so we can go trick it into thinking it knows what it's doing. I'm going to overcast a seam. That didn't. Stitch 2. It's not giving me the option I thought I would. Well then, we're going to select, you can do this with a zigzag, or there's some other stitches that you can use. We'll do one side with a zigzag and then pick a different stitch for the other side. So we're just going to be sewing through just that loose seam allowance. The rest of our pant legs are not in there. And this is a stitch where I would not start full speed ahead with your foot pedal. I would make sure that this is landing where you want it to either side of this foot. So it's going to do the zig into the fabric and the zag we want to land just the other side of that bar. I'm actually going to make this a little bit wider. So it's just going to land other side of that bar when it gets going. And the one thing I'm noticing right away is that that's curling a little bit, and I would like it to lay flat because it would be comfier inside my pants. So I'm actually going to reduce the upper tension just a little bit. So on this machine that's on screen. Yikes. So that little 2A gives the thread more space to breathe. And I'm going to lengthen that a little bit. So this is something I would test with before you're actually sewing your pants. But yeah, Bernina's got videos on using their overcasting foot, the 2A overlocking foot. So that's one stitch you could do. And what that does is it just keeps these stringy bits from running on you. It'll protect it as it goes. So that's one stitch you could do with that. The other one that Anne likes for finishing seams, and I know we did this in the video where we made bags, was that stitch. You do that one back with your regular number 1 foot. There's a few options for overlock stitches. So you might need to make friends with your machine and see what you have. But a zigzag will do the trick. So find one that makes you happy. I'm going to go back and do that honeycomb one. Who let me out of the house today? My goodness. So essentially, if you're going to finish your seam allowances separately on both sides, you're sewing this seam 3 times, which seems like 2 times too many to me. So this would keep your seams from fraying as well. A little bulkier inside there, but it would definitely work for you. So that's one option. Your next option is to just sew that same 5/8 seam allowance, or 1/4 inch, or whatever size it is. And then we could press this and serge the seam allowances. I'm going to press this open again. Then at this point, you could go serge those seam allowances, and you could either do that with them, you could do that together. So you could serge your seam allowances into a pair, which seems like what I want to do right now. Or you could do them individually if you're looking to reduce bulk. And when you're doing this, what you're looking for on your presser foot with your serger, there's usually a guide on the foot as to where the left needle line is showing up. Your left needle line is your seam line. So on this, I'm just finishing seams, so I'm going to keep the seam that I've already made further away and keep some extra bulk. But you probably do want to be trimming a little bit off as you go. But lining up that seam line that you already made with something on your foot will keep you going straight. And now we have a sewn line and a serge to finish the seam. And you've still sewn it twice, which still seems like one too many times for pajama pants, in my opinion. So option number 3 is the 1-step shot, which is, in my opinion, the way to do pajama pants, because work smarter, not harder. So like I said, our On your serger, there is a marking on your foot as to where that 5/8 seam allowance is showing up. I'm going to mark 5/8 on here so it makes more sense when you're watching me serge. The Bernina sergers have a seam guide that clips onto the stitch plate, or clips over the stitch plate, so it's really easy to keep it accurate. On other sergers, you'll want to do a test run with your required seam allowance to see where you need to place your fabric in relation to your cutter. Some of the machines, your door physically is going to move as you adjust your cutting width, and that's going to change the final width of your stitch, but you need the proper construction width. So I would do an experiment first where you draw out the seam allowance you need, and then figure out on your machine where to put your fabric to get a little bit cut off and have your seam line in the right place. So I know for me, I have the Bernina 460 at home as well. So normally for something like this, I would have my seam guide clipped on here, but I ran out of time to go grab it out of the box. So what I'm going to do is, to the edge of the foot here is about 3/8, and that means there's another 1/4 inch past the edge of the foot, and I'm going to keep it consistently that wide. I also marked this as I went. So first things first, if you want to secure your seam, depending on your machine, you might be able to, I like securing my serger seams, start and end. So on this one, there's a little release for the stitch finger, and then you can gently release the threads off the back of the stitch pin plates and wrap those around in front. And then cut that off as you go. And then to finish our seam, I'm going to drop the needles, lift the foot, slight wiggle backwards, and then it's a lift and flip, and put that right back in front of the needles. And then you can go backwards a little ways and serge off. So, just like that, both ends are secured, and you have a little bit of extra thread to deal with, but not all that much. And then you can pull these looper threads tight and tighten that down nice and flat. So we have taken off, some fabric, that original 5/8 seam allowance, but we've done this in one step. So it's secured, we can press this and we're ready to move onward. So this is how I would make pajama pants. And the other thing I mentioned earlier was if you're making crazy colored pajama pants, you don't necessarily need to buy 4 colors of crazy colored thread. You can just buy one. The only one that will show on the outside of your garment if you're having any tension things, or if you see the stitch, is your left needle thread. So that's the only one I would change out to match this blue fabric. So if that's kind of making sense, let's make pajama pants as quickly as we can, because you guys don't want to hang out with me all day. Let's find my instructions. So like I said, pajama pants are 5 instructions, and they're easy. So step 1, we're going to sew fronts together down the front and backs together down the center back. That's the bit that sits over your bum. And that's why we have notches, so we can tell the difference between fronts and backs. And I would pin these because it'll make your life happier. So this is the back piece, so there's notches there's notches back here. And I cut these one at a time yesterday to conserve fabric, so they don't actually line up perfectly. And then I would actually like to sew them from I would like to sew them from midpoint of the crotch up. My preference at this point, I want that crotch point to be super bang on. So I'm going to start at that end. You should pin when you're flat on the table, not over a pile of other things. See how much stuff I can throw on the floor. Stay stitching is definitely a good idea. Definitely on fabrics that that are going to shift and move on you and stretch as you sew them. This flannel's pretty sturdy. And remember, we're aiming for pretty good. They're pajama pants. I don't think I cut those exactly the same. So, like I said, this particular pattern calls for a 1/4 inch seam allowance. 1/4 inch on here is going to be 1/4 inch from our left needle line is just at this second mark over here. It's a really skinny little seam for a serger. So it's just going to barely go under the cutter. And based on how this is going to go together in a minute, I'm actually not going to finish this seam on this side this way. So just barely cutting fabric as I go. And then I take my pins out long before I ever get them to the foot. And this is actually just going to take those notches off as we go around the corner here. And up the back, the center back. So one seam. Let's go. We have pant backs. Let's go find another seam and do the same thing all over again. Maybe with less pins. We're going rogue. So the crotch of your pants, if this point in your pants doesn't meet up right at the crotch properly, it's going to be a whole lot harder to work with fronts and backs together than adjusting for a little bit of inconsistency at the waistband, because that's going to get folded in. So really it's personal preference. But some things are just easier to sew one direction than the other. And you might not know what that is until you give it a try. So we're going to press this seam and then we'll do the next bit of sewing. Yeah, and like there's other ways of finishing your seam. So pinking shears, if you need to clip corners. This is a 1/4 inch seam on here, and I've serged the whole thing. So the last thing you want to do with a serge seam is clip corners, because that will be unclipping your threads. And then probably on pajama pants, I would press these to one side, which is where I think my iron went to sleep. It's not feeling as hot. But again, pajama pants are super forgiving. This is not going to be a big deal in the long run. This is proper pants, it would matter. So there's a pair of fronts. Here's a pair of backs. If I press both of these the same direction, they should probably nest okay once they're lined up. So now we have a front and a back. What's next? Let's go find our pattern. Let's go find our instructions, and we'll do the next step. So step 1 was build fronts and backs. Step 2, inside of the inseam, and you're going to sew that from one leg into the other leg, all in one go, and then outside seams. So I am going to pin that a little bit because I would like my crotch seams to line up. So critical point on your pants is that crotch point where your fronts and backs and lefts and rights meet. So other than that, pajama pants are really super forgiving, but you'll want that point to be dead on. And then we'll just go down that inseam on each leg. We'll see if I added the same amount to the fronts and backs when I lengthen this pattern. This is your checking point. We're like, did I do this properly? And I'm only pinning about every 3 inches right now. Every 4 inches. It's enough for what this fabric is. And I know that the flannel is going to stick to itself as I lay it out. Oh man, I made these the same length on both legs. Front and back. Okay, so off we go again. Back to the serger. And we're still doing that 1/4 inch seam allowance. So that first pin in there is just to get me started and keep things in place until I'm at the serger after I So coming up to that crotch seam, I'm just going to make sure that those are, I did have them nestled there. You might notice as I come up to the end here, there was a little curve back outward. That's to account for the angle on the hem. Okay, so that one was pretty easy. I'm going to do the next 2 with no pins. So the next seam is just outside seams, left and right legs. And it's starting to look like pajama pants to me. And I'm going to start at the top because I'm much more concerned about the waist being even than the bottom of the leg. Bottom of the leg wonkiness you can account for when you're done. No, I don't think I cut those quite the same. But my daughter's one leg is shorter than the other. The downside to not pinning. Okay, so without pins, got a little bit of shrinkage there. Not a big deal. It'll be okay. We'll just account for that when we turn up our hems. So at this point, I am going to finish the rest of my seams, and then we'll go to the iron and press down the hem, or press up the hems on the pant legs and press down the cuff for the waistband, or press down the waistband. So for a cuff, when you want to go to finish these seams, and you're on a serger, I'm not really going to trim much fabric off. We're going to come in at an angle. And I'm just going to even that out as I go, because I think it'll be just fine. And then as I get back to where I started, it's going to overlap and drive off. All those lovely tails and one more for the waistband. Okay, 2 steps left, other than elastic. 2 sewing steps. We're just going to go read our instructions again. You could put the elastic on the waistband with the serger. My personal preference is to make a casing. I like making a casing. It's my preferred method. I feel like there's more to handle if you don't make a casing. So let's go back to our pattern. In this instruction, this was this step. Overcast the waist edge. So that's that serge seam I just did around the bottom of the hem and the top of the pant. So to form a casing, I made a size large. And it says to fold waist down 1 1/4 inches to wrong side and press. I brought this hot hammer that we showed you a couple days ago. It's a Clover Hot Hemmer. It's kind of hard, like really hard felt, but it's got all these great markings on it. So that 1 1/4 inch marking to fold down, I can fold down a big long section at 1 1/4 inch, which is going to make me mighty happy. So I'm turning the pants right side out. So with this hot hammer, I'm going to start at the center back, and it said to fold down 1 1/4 inch. So 1 1/4 inch straight down on the back. And I can do a whole section at once without burning my fingers, which makes me mighty happy. We make a lot of funny little samples here that aren't much good for anything after we're done. So lots of our demos out front don't amount to anything we could show off and take home. So it's nice to have a finished product at the end of something. So loving the hot hammer, not gonna lie. Very, very big fan. Going around and doing this on longer things with just a little seam guide. The little metal seam guides get hot, which turns out I don't like burning my fingers. And this thing is staying a nice temperature. So I could do the same thing with the hem, but I'm actually going to hem these after I get home with the girl in them, because I don't know how much I need to hem them up right now. So I'm going to finish this next step on sewing machine. And we will sew most of the casing, and then we can fish some elastic through. So having the free arm on your machine, it's really nice at this stage. I turn this up 1.25 inches. I normally sew these from the right side because I'm going to look at the right side. But it'll be easier to show you where I'm lining up if I do it from the other way. And you could definitely throw some pins on here if you wanted. I'm just going to put a pin in where I need to stop and start for my elastic. Otherwise I go all the way around and have to unpick, which really takes all the fun out of it. So this is folded up 1.25 inches. So counting on our stitch plate again, 1/4 inch, 3/8, 1/2 inch, 5/8, 3/4, 7/8, and this is a 1 inch line. So if I line the fabric up at that 1 inch line, my stitch should be landing right there. The elastic I have, before I get way too excited, let's make sure that my elastic's going to fit in there somewhat happily. My elastic is 1 inch, so I'm actually going to give myself a little more space, and on this machine I'm actually just going to move my needle over a couple needle positions. I'll still be catching in the serging, but I'll just have a little more wiggle room for my elastic, which I think will make me happier. And then I'm going to start up here. And because you want this even from the outside, I'm keeping the edge of my fabric lined up over here, not watching where the needle's landing, because the serging might not be perfect, but the distance up from the fold is what really matters here. And kind of for reference, because I didn't pin this all the way around, every quarter I'm just making sure my my seam lines are landing on top of each other, just to account for that little bit of shiftiness that happens with fabric. So that was pretty painless. The next question is, do I have a bodkin back here? Apparently we're sold out of bodkins, but we have this other tool. It might do the trick. So this is an easy loop turner, but it's got this opening that I think I can squeeze the elastic into. And we're going to follow the instructions for how big to cut this elastic for the size large. So on the large, it says to cut the elastic 23 inches. Usually the elastic is a little bit smaller than the finished size, and that's so that it has something to do, like pull your pants and keep them up. So this tube turner thing might go through my waistband. We're going to give it a shot. And then I left an opening in the waistband. There's an opening! There we go. And the nice thing about the no-fold waistband elastic is you can feel it as it goes in flat. Safety pin works too. Usually when I use a safety pin, everything twists on me, which I find really aggravating. Because trying to untwist no-roll waistband elastic is tricky. And then before things go wonky on you, I would make sure you're holding on to both pieces of elastic. And maybe I will pin that for a second. You want to make sure there's no rolls in your waistband elastic before you sew it all the way in. So that's laying mighty flat. And at this point, the instructions in here make this harder because they have you make the loop of the elastic first instead of pinning it, sewing it through the casing. Everybody's different, and there's a lot of ways of doing this. This is the way I like to do it. And then I would sew my elastic shut. And my elastic is overlapped just a little bit and might have opinions on how best to do this next step. I use a multi-step zigzag like that because it'll have a little bit of give, and on the overlapping elastic it will hold it together. So I know my elastic's flat in my casing. And that multi-step zigzag will feed with elastic a little better. And then normally I go backwards. So and then depending how much overlap you had in there, you could definitely stitch that other. I left quite a bit of overlap because Sarah's such a skinny little kid. But this will still have some movement if it needs to stretch. And so the same way I sewed the casing is how I would do the hems. But on Sarah's stuff here, I'm going to hem it when I'm home because I can turn up a longer hem if I need to because I left more space. I added an inch more than she actually needed so that I could let down the seam as I go. And the last step up top, I'm also going to do that step at home. I've got some little sew-in labels that say cute things. So I'm going to sew one of those in so she knows where the back of her pants is. But at this point, I have a hem and 3 inches of casing left to close right there. But I could close that casing with a tag in it. So the other thing you can do to keep your non-roll elastic from moving at all, usually I do it on the side seams. I usually just sew a straight stitch through there, kind of right in the ditch, and that will keep your elastic and your fabric together, and keep it evenly spaced. I usually do that on both sides. Hubby's pajama pants, I usually do it kind of center front and center back, and I would do that after my casing is closed and my elastic is all even all the way around. Let's just hang those over there. Custom length, ridiculous big flowers. There you go, pajama pants. Don't be afraid to give them a try. Really, they're not hard. With all my talking and teaching as I go, this took way longer than the next couple pairs are going to take me at home. But now I know I have a pattern that's going to fit her, and maybe we'll whip off a couple pairs because all her PJ pants have holes in the knees and none of them fit. They're all too short. Yeah, no roll elastic shouldn't roll in the casing. I still like to tack it, personal preference, but it's firm, it doesn't roll. So it should be good. Oh, one more thing. Free motion quilting next week. That panel. You're welcome to order the panel or order it as a kit with the batting and backing. We're going to sit with Barb and do some practice free motion quilting. Thanks for joining me. Take care, be kind, be calm, be safe, and we will talk to you guys next week. Thanks, guys. Bye.